Then Swansea Studios reopened
in Alexandra Road.
in 1952. I went there as a senior engineer.
Right. So at that point in 1952, when Dylan was doing some of his last broadcasts, he came to the studio when you were there.
Well, in late 19 October 1953, Dylan comes to the studio to record his poems. I set up the studio for him. He stood in front of the microphone. I watched him and listened to him read his poem. Spontaneously, no reference to...
Did you have headphones on, or did...
No, I had a loudspeaker there.
Right. So you heard it straight out of the loudspeaker, straight from his voice.
But I watched him, you see, and listened to him.
And what was he? Did he gesticulate, or did he?
No, he just stood in front of the microphone and said his pieces.
Right. Can you remember any of them?
Not really, Jeff, I must admit.
But can you remember being impressed by it? Did you?
Oh, totally impressed with his voice, which enhanced the quality of his poems.
But you,
Wonderful voice.
you've got a lovely voice, and you've not got much of a Welsh accent. Dylan didn't have a Welsh accent either,
The
did he?
nearest to Dylan Thomas is Richard Burton as a voice. But you know, to actually listen to them
Sure.
in the studio, I think it's quite unique.
Absolutely.
Quite an experience.
Have you listened to the recordings of him since then?
Now, the recordings were actually made in Cardiff, not in Swansea. I set up the equipment, went to Cardiff, and they recorded it. Now, what's happened to those recordings, I don't know.
Do they exist?
Yeah, most of them are out. When Dylan Thomas went to America, two young girls on his first trip heard him read, and they were so impressed they were in publishing. And they went to their publishers and said, "We've got to record this man, and we've got to put out records of him." And the publisher said no, it wasn't on. So they founded their own record label called Caedmon. And they recorded Dylan doing A Child's Christmas in Wales and 5 poems, and they put it out as an LP. And it was a huge success. So they continued to record Dylan, but they went to the BBC and they bought BBC recordings, and they ended up, at the moment you can buy a box set of 11 CDs of Dylan Thomas reading his poems, his stories, giving little lectures. So there's an incredible sound archive that Sydney was the start of. You know, if he hadn't have been there recording those poems then, we wouldn't have this great archive that we've got. No, it's quite amazing that you sat and learned.
May I tell you this, Jeff?
Of course.
Late October 1953. The next day, I go to the BBC on a course,
Yes.
BBC on Evesham.
Yes.
Good North in Evesham.
Right, to London on a
Now,
course.
I was there on the 9th of November.
Right.
News came through that Dylan had died in America.
So you were up in London working at the BBC when that news came through.
No, I
Evesham.
Yes.
And it was only days after you recorded him.
Which was a big college there. We went on a refresher course.
So within days of recording him, you hear of his death.
Absolutely. Well,
And
totally shocked.
when you saw him read, did he look unwell? Or
He looked fine. He was carefully dressed. With no flamboyancy at all.
no?
To hear just a fortnight later that he died was quite amusing.
That's amazing. Yeah.
But I'm still puzzled what happened to the recording.
I think a lot of them got preserved and they came out in LPs, but not all of them, I'm sure.
Because Aaron Tarvin Davis was a producer. He brought Dylan in.
You'd have expected him to look after
so listen.
those recordings because he was a big fan of Dylan's as well.
I've got a little surprise for you, and you can tell me whether what somebody gave me these many years ago. Megan used to run a private school in Swansea, Oakley House, and she'd done a lot of a spoken word. And she said to me, "This says on here, BBC internal mail." There's a BBC bag. She told me that these were the headphones that Dylan wore when he did his recordings. Is that true? Does it look like what you used to see?
Well,
say yes.
no. Honestly, I don't recognise it.
There we are.
And they're much too heavy. I don't really know these headphones.
And he did start recording back in 1937. He recorded in the Grove in the islands. So maybe they came from there.
Well, John Griffiths was the senior drama producer, and he invited Dylan Thomas,
John
Daniel Jones,
Fred James, John Pritchard.
Now, John Pritchard, I know nothing about him at all.
Right. You wrote one book.
Let's confess. But John Griffiths had him in this little studio
In the Grove.
in the Grove, Uplands, a temporary place prior to.
It's still there. With a little building in the Uplands in Swansea. It looks like it was a church afterwards, but they had it as a makeshift studio. Carry on.
Well, I used to go there from Cardiff, not on that occasion, in fact. You know, in fact, I missed that.
That was the recording I talked about called Swansea in the Arts, where those boys that Sid has just named, Dan Jones, Alfred James, John Pritchard, Vernon Watkins, they're the core of what's become known as the Cardoma Boys. So we saw where the Cardoma was in town. So they got those boys into that little studio and they recorded a broadcast called Swansea in the Arts. And one at a time they all said why they liked living in Swansea and why it was good for the arts. And Dylan Thomas introduced it, and he talked about he liked being in Swansea. He didn't like it in London because they were all +4s and no breakfast. And he said something like, when I'm up in London, I say, I live in Swansea because Kumbula is good for my guashes. You know, he just, and you know, he made out that he'd gone to London where his friends had stayed in Swansea. It's a wonderful broadcast. It's not. Well, it's not. We don't have a recording of that.
That was featured in the Radio Times
On the cover.
when I had the scripture.
Yes. I've got Vernon Watkins' copy of it. Yes. It's a nice script. But you know what I've just found? I've actually got the Radio Times as well with them on this cover. Have you got
That lovely picture.
Yes, of them all.
John Griffiths standing.
Yeah.
Dylan,
Fred,
James,
Dan.
Fred James, and Daniel Jones, and Pritchard.
And Vernon's in there as well. Vernon Watkins on it as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
Vernon Watkins.
With white hair.
Well, actually, Dylan is there. Vernon Watkins is next to him. Then there's Daniel Jones. And then there's Jack Pritchard.
Yeah.
I know nothing about
Richard was in school with Dylan Thomas, and he was a bit of a musician, and he wrote poems early on, and then he wrote one book called The Story of the Alphabet. It's a nice book, and then he sort of disappears. But no, that was an interesting recording. It would have been